Lovely to be with you all this Sunday morning. The topic for today's satsang is be a warrior, don't be a worrier. I want to start with this really amazing story. It's a real story. It's actually of a family, a devotee family that lives in Ananda village. And these parents, the mother and father, deep devotees of Master. They have been so for many years, and they have a family of 4 children. And when one of the kids grew up, he was an adult, he sort of was thinking about where his career, etc., direction would go, and he decided that he wanted to be a movie actor. So he said, well, if I'm in California, so he said, okay, I need to move to LA to become a movie actor. And he does so. And his mother goes to visit him once in LA. And of course, being a devotee of Master, when you're in LA, you have to go to Forest Lawn. That's where Master's body is kept. That's where his crypt is. So she says, she tells her son, you come with me, we'll go together. So he goes with her. And of course, when she goes to the crypt, then, she bowed down, she touched her forehead on his tombstone. And then she told her son, why don't you do the same as well? You'll receive blessings. And of course, even though he had grown up at Ananda village, he wasn't particularly deeply connected to Master yet. But he said, of course, his mom is saying that. And he had deep reverence for Master. So he did the same. He went and he touched his forehead at the crypt. And just at that instant when he touched his forehead, there was a flash of light, and he was taken into this deep vision. And the vision where he was actually on a battlefield. He was dying on a battlefield, and in the distance, he actually saw his king, on a majestic horse, and the king was smiling at him, and he was dying. And when he deeply looked at the face of the king, he actually saw it was Master's face. And Master told him in the vision that you fought for me bravely in that lifetime, won't you fight for me bravely now? Right? And what an amazing story that is. And of course, that's where the vision ended. And now, guess what? He's given up being a movie actor. He's actually back in Ananda village, and he serves at Ananda village full time. Now, what I find very interesting is that the 3 incarnations that Master told us about, that he was those specific people. So Master told us that he was Arjuna, and we know about Arjuna during the Mahabharata. Master also said he was William the Conqueror, who was actually instrumental in uniting England and really creating the country of England, also setting up the system of English law, also forming the foundations of the English language to a certain extent. And Master also said that he was Ferdinand III of Spain, who was actually a great warrior king, and he actually prevented the Moors from invading Spain at that time, and really preserving Christianity in Spain. And what I've reflected on often is the fact that why Master chose to tell us about those 3 specific incarnations. He would have had many more, but he told us about those 3, where all those 3, he was a great warrior king, and he had fought many, many battles. Now, what's very interesting is that also when you read scriptures of virtually every religion, and you really tune into what they're trying to say, many of those scriptures are actually based or set on a battlefield. Right? Now, isn't that very interesting as well? That why are they set on a battlefield? Because scripture is trying to show us what is the right attitude to have in life, because life itself is a battlefield. It's a battle between the forces of darkness versus the forces of light. The force of adharma versus the force of dharma. The force of being sort of, a downward pulling contractive force versus an upward pulling expansive energy. And when we think about our own lives, for example, right, what do we normally say? We sort of think that, the whole world tells us the whole purpose of life is just to accumulate things and just for a life to be easy and comfortable. Isn't that what we sort of perceive? That's what a life should be. But when we read the stories of the greatest people who have ever lived in history, we actually observe that they never craved an easy and comfortable life. They actually craved a glorious life, right? And they craved a glorious life not for themselves. They craved a glorious life in service to others. It was really about fulfilling a higher purpose that was much bigger than themselves. That was the reason why their lives were glorious in the first place. And none of those greatest people when you really delve into their own life histories, do you ever find that they had it all very easy and laid out for them? They had to fight a huge battle, and they had to face many, many challenges in order to achieve that glory that ultimately that came to them, right? Now, when we know that, and we love those stories, we tell all our children about these stories because there's something great in them and there's something so inspiring in them. But at the same time, when we have those same challenges come to us to help us become bigger, how do we respond? That the first temptation is to want to resist it. No, this is just too much, Or we tend to complain, "Arey, isne वापस ये कर दिया, अरे मेरे साथ ये वापस हो गया." Is that attitude of complaining. Or probably the worst attitude out of all is to be afraid of it. To actually say, you know what, this is too much for me, or I'm being worried that we're not going to be able to handle that challenge. And as devotees on the path, we know that that is not the right attitude. We know that we don't want to be afraid. We know that we want to face our challenges bravely, but somehow, I don't know how it happens, we get sort of trapped by our bad habits, right? We sort of get trapped into this vortex where we know that we have to face it bravely, but at the same time, we tend to shrink away from those challenges. And that is the kind of cycle that we need to break somehow. Master, in all his teachings, he actually tells us many, many ways in which we can face our challenges bravely and we can overcome those challenges. And I just want to share 3 ideas with you that might help us in our day-to-day lives on how we can actually face these challenges. The first is really to ask this question to ourselves very often, perhaps every day if we can, is who am I really? And what am I doing here? Or why am I in this body, and why am I this incarnation? What really is going on? And this is a very, very powerful question, because what happens is that in our day-to-day lives, whenever we're fighting our daily battles, we sort of lose the plot a little bit. We sort of forget that we're actually only temporary visitors on this plane of existence, and we're actually here for a certain purpose. We sort of get too entangled in what we have to do on a daily basis, right? Isn't that what happens? But Master tells us that we are actually in he calls it a great cosmic motion picture. Master says that God has staged this whole cosmic drama to help his little children, that's all of us, to be educated and to be entertained. That's what Master says is the goal of life. But then Master adds very sort of sadly, he says, alas, but how few people, or how few children are either entertained or educated, right? Isn't that very interesting? So always when we ask this question, so the one question that I try to ask myself often is this challenge that I'm facing today, this problem that I'm facing today, what will this problem mean for me in 5 years' time? Right? So whenever you have the challenges, ask this question, what will this mean for me in 5 years' time? Then perhaps expand that, say that what will this mean to me in 50 years' time? Right? And then expand that further. Where will I be in 500 years? Or where will I be in 5,000 years? Perhaps 5 million years? Where was I? What was I doing 5 million years ago? When you ask those questions to yourself, the whole perspective shifts suddenly. And of course, the worldly mind might just say that, well, in 5 million years, I'm just going to be dead. So how does it even matter, right? And of course, well, that's, even if you take that line of argument, you can say, well, if it doesn't matter, then why are you so worried about that problem today? You shouldn't be worried. But to a yogi, that answer that I'm going to be dead in 5 million years is not relevant. That doesn't satisfy the yogi somehow, right? Because it's too bland a response. So what we want as yogis is that we want to listen to what Krishna is saying. And what does Krishna say? Krishna says the soul never dies. So if the soul, that sense of I, that consciousness that I have, if it never dies, that means it is going to exist in how many ever million, billion years. It has always existed and will always continue to exist. And if it is always going to continue to exist, then, and if I project myself at that point in time, what will this I be doing? Will I be complaining about, on some other planet saying, oh, this traffic is terrible, or, still arguing with my boss about I need this promotion, or still telling my children to behave? Will I still be involved in all of those things at that point in time, or will I want to be free, of those? So try and live life in what Master calls longer rhythms. Try and see life from a much, much bigger perspective. There's actually quite a fun story of Jyotishji, who is the Dharmacharya of Ananda Sangha worldwide. And this is the early days of Ananda, when the construction there was quite primitive, and they used to live in these geodesic domes, and many of those domes used to leak when it used to rain very, very heavily. And so these great souls, they didn't have too many resources, so they would devise some sort of contraption in order to prevent the water from actually seeping in. So as it happened, this in Jyotishi's geodesic dome, and he's a very scientific guy, so he sort of likes to do all these contraptions. So he had devised this way where wherever the leaks were, they would fall into these kind of urns, and then there was a pipe connected to that, and that water would lead into another area, and then it would fall into another bucket, and then the bucket had another pipe going from somewhere else, and basically that water would somehow, that is falling on the leaf, get guided into the drain, right? And as it happens, Ashaji, who's in fact going to be here next weekend, she happened to come into his room when it was a very, very stormy kind of a night, and the whole dome was shaking because of the storm, and the whole contraption was making so much noise. And she came into his dome, and she saw him very calmly sitting on a chair reading a book, right? And there was all this noise going on. And Ashaji said to Jyotishi, Jyotish, how do you live like this? I mean, what chaos is going around? And very calmly he looked at her and he said, as long as it's temporary, he said, I can face anything. And then he added, actually, he said, and when you come to think of it, everything in life is temporary, right? So that is the kind of attitude that we need to have. You need to start and say, well, as long as it's temporary, I can face anything. And everything in life is temporary. So whenever we have that challenge or the problem in front of us, really face that challenge with all your courage and with all the bravery, and say that, I can face anything. As Yukteswarji says, when you look fear in the eye, it will cease to trouble you. And when you face that challenge, try and look into what is that challenge trying to teach you. Right? What is our temptation first whenever we are actually facing our battles of life is to somehow fix the circumstances, right? And we just want to change the outer circumstance and not worry too much about, I don't care about the lesson I have to learn in this, I just want to fix the problem, right? Isn't that the attitude? But you'll find that if we don't learn the lesson, what happens? Somehow or the other, even if you're able to fix the circumstances, somehow or the other, that lesson manifests in some other way. And you'll find that again and again, life will keep giving you circumstances until you've gone to the root and learned the lesson. So whenever you're facing an issue, try and become aware, what is this situation trying to teach me, and what am I supposed to learn? And the faster we learn it, the faster those issues will get fixed. In fact, there is actually another story of Swamiji when he was a young monk at Mount Washington, and one of his brother monks, Norman, so he was deeply devoted to Master, but after several years of serving Master, he left Mount Washington. And one of the primary reasons he left because he couldn't stand one of the other monks, whose name was Jerry. So he left, and and a few months later, after leaving, he came back and he met Swamiji, and he was sort of reminiscing with him. He said, Walter, the reason I left Mount Washington was primarily because I couldn't stand Jerry. Well, guess what? The place where I'm working, there are 6 other Jerrys out there. And that is exactly, and you'll experience this in your life again and again. If you run away from a situation, it will just keep following you until we've actually resolved it. So when we have that attitude, and of course, facing a challenge requires willpower. It requires that inner strength, and it requires energy. But what does Master say? What is the main tenet of the energization exercises? He says, the greater the will, the greater the flow of energy. So if we have that willpower to want to face the challenge, you'll find that the energy actually follows and gives us the strength and courage to face it. So that was one of the ideas I wanted to share. The second idea I want to share is really try and reflect on what is our environment like. As Master says, environment is stronger than willpower. So more than our willpower, we need to focus on really what is my environment giving to me, and is that giving me the ability to become stronger, or is that actually weakening my ability? Is it actually creating that fear and worry inside me? And if you just think about, for example, a newspaper, when we, many people have the habit of actually just, every morning waking up, opening the newspaper and reading the newspaper. But if you just see the news that's actually being published, what is that news all the time? It's about some political scandal. It is about, this building that collapsed. It is about some businessman who, ran away from India with, a few thousand crores. And I'm always surprised how every new businessman who runs away, there's one more zero that gets added to that number somehow. I don't know how it happens, but it does. And that is the news that we're actually taking in within ourselves first thing in the morning. So it's that, if you see, basically the undercurrent of all of the news is really this fear that's constantly being generated. What is happening to this world? How will these things ever get resolved? We live in, and you just, if an alien came to Earth and just picked up the Times of India and read that, he would be shocked. He'd be like, what is going on with these people? What are they actually doing? Is there anything even good happening on this planet? And of course, there's a lot of good that's happening on this planet, but unfortunately, a lot of the news doesn't seem to cover it. Now, I was just visualizing, wouldn't it be amazing if the Times of India decided that on the front cover page, only half the page is going to be about your general news, where you need to be aware of what is happening, and the other half is dedicated to stories of courage, stories of bravery, stories of love, stories of service, stories about how people are helping each other, stories about the spiritual search, stories about God. Just think about what that would do to the consciousness of the city. If you think about it, if you had two parts of the Times of India, the top with those sort of fearful stories and the bottom of it, which one would you read? And I think most human beings, most of us in the city would actually read that bottom half, which had the stories of courage, because that is what inspires us. That is what we want to know about. In the same way, television, right? What are we paying attention to when we watch TV? The news channels, oh my God. I mean, it's terrible how they actually sensationalize. It's just communicating news with fear. It's all about that, and we sort of take that in. I mean, again, I was just reflecting, wouldn't it be amazing if Arnab Goswami, right, hosting his show with his 6 panelists or 8 panelists, how many ever you can squeeze into that screen, rather than fighting about some political scandal, they are fighting about who loves God more. I mean, just think about that. What would happen to the consciousness of people if they were to experience something like that? In the same way, social media, so all the stuff on Facebook and Twitter and just all of that, so much of that is focused about emphasizing, each one emphasizing their own egos, telling, this whole thing of trolling and showing how people are wrong, and it's terrible. And if we keep exposing ourselves to that vibration, what happens is that we ourselves become part of that vibration. We ourselves, and these are real things, the vibration of fear, the vibration of worry is a real vibration. And if it's a question of, are we in tune with that vibration, or do we choose to step above it? In the same way, other people, we all have some person in our lives, whether, voluntarily or involuntarily, who is just always negative. Isn't it true? I mean, if you say something, say good to that person, oh, guess what? This amazing donor donated several lakhs to this particular temple, and now there's going to be a beautiful temple built. And he'd be like, well, he must be wanting to launder money. That's why he did it, Or if you say, oh, this politician, did something amazing for this village, and now this village is going to have running water. You're like, "Arey, bahut votes ke liye kiya hai, obviously." So, if you find that if people around you are constantly being negative, that will also affect you. As Master said, it's all about magnetism, and the stronger magnet affects the weaker magnet. So try and become more and more conscious about your environment. What are you exposing yourself to? Is it a vibration of fear and worry, or is it a vibration of strength and courage? And if you can, change that vibration, because you'll find that if we're constantly vibrating on that fear and worry, then that is what we tend to attract. We'll get more and more of it, and the universe, that's the principle it works on. If you sort of ask for something, you will simply get it. So if you ask for worry, you will get that worry. And what's even worse is that when we are vibrating on that frequency, what tends to happen to us when we give to others, what do we end up giving to others? We end up giving fear, we end up giving worry as well. And what that does, it just creates this karmic loop. What we give out to others, we get back to ourselves. So we need to break this cycle somehow, and we break it by essentially channeling out the opposite of fear, right? And essentially broadcasting that from ourselves. And what is the opposite of fear? Now, of course, you would think, well, courage is the opposite of fear, and that's true to a certain extent. But as Shubha just said, and as Jesus suggests something very interesting, he says, perfect love casts out all fear. Think about that. So Jesus says the opposite of fear is actually love, which is so interesting. So when we feel that we are trapped in this consciousness of fear and worry, finding it difficult to face a challenge, what we need to shift our focus and attention on is actually on love. On loving, and not loving ourselves. We love ourselves enough. What we need to focus on is to actually loving other people, to loving others. And we do that by essentially helping others, by thinking of ourselves not as me, as Swamiji in one of his songs says, I, my, me, mine, So we break that sense of ego identification, and we essentially expand that self of identity, where we say that I am everything that's around me, I'm part of that, and essentially I want to help others. And you'll find that when we shift that consciousness of wanting to help others, you'll find that energy that we put out essentially comes back to help us. So in fact, very often the same challenge that we are having, that we ourselves are facing, try and see if you can find someone, or there will inevitably be someone in your life who needs help in a very similar way. So rather than just helping yourself, also help them. And when you help them, you'll find that you yourself will be helped. And in fact, when you really start reflecting, almost all the time, most of the challenges that have come to us just for that same precise purpose. And the precise purpose is to break ourselves of our individual egoic identity, the identity that I am separate from everyone else. And when you find that when you break that identity, then when you start identifying with everyone and with expanding your sense of identity, then you'll find the purpose of that challenge is actually served, and it just goes away. So reflect on that. And the third idea I wanted to share was really trying to tune into God's will. What does God want out of this experience that is coming to me? There is a beautiful story of this person called Richard Wurmbrand, who is a very saintly man and who lived in Europe around the World War, the Second World War, and just after the Second World War. And as it happened, so he was born a Jew. He converted to Christianity, and he preached the teachings of Christ. He taught the teachings of Christ. And he found himself, after the Second World War, he found himself in communist Romania. And the communists didn't want the teachings of Christ to be taught. They wanted to crush them. So as it happens, after the Second World War, he actually was captured by the communists, and he was taken into prison. And for many years, he was actually tortured in prison. And he was tortured in many different ways. And they tried to torture him to break his faith in Jesus. And of course, this went on for many, many years. And there was a particular time when perhaps the lowest point of that period, when he found himself in solitary confinement in a small, tiny room, and he was blindfolded, and he was asked to, as torture, he was asked to walk around that room. It was probably, I don't know, maybe 5 feet by 5 feet, a tiny room. And he was asked to walk around that room continuously, whole day, whole night. And he found himself just at the breaking point. And then he asked, and this thought came to him, he said, could this be happening outside the will of Jesus? This experience is happening to me. Could it be happening outside the will of Jesus? And the obvious answer to that was no. And then he said, well, if this is the will of Jesus, then why am I resisting it? And for him, that was a huge turning point. So then he said, well, if Jesus wants me to walk around this room blindfolded, I'm going to happily walk around this room blindfolded. So what happened? It converted, that experience converted into an act of devotional serving, the service to Jesus. And he said, Jesus, I'm happily going to walk around. And that's what he continued to do. And he became, as he walked around the room, he became more and more and more joyful. And he was smiling and he was radiating. And the guards were completely confused. They couldn't understand what was going on, but they saw that joy that was coming out of him, and they stopped torturing him. And of course, then after that, he was ransomed out of Romania, taken to America. So whenever we have these challenges, which some of them are really hard challenges, ask this question to yourself: could this be happening outside the will of God? And when you get that answer, you know that if this is the will of God, then why am I so worried? What am I afraid of? In fact, we often, whenever we have difficult challenges, we often think, right, it is that person who caused this. So it's my mother-in-law who caused this to me, my boss who caused this to me, this other person who caused this challenge to come into my life. But if you really reflect, it was not that person. It was not any of your family members or anyone outside. It was actually God himself who brought this challenge to you. Think about it, the story of the Mahabharata. Krishna is the warrior, he represents us. Sorry, Arjuna is the warrior, he represents us. And Krishna is the guru. But Krishna is the one who is in charge of the chariot, right? And what does the charioteer do? The charioteer is actually taking the warrior to different battles. So in the battle of Kurukshetra, Krishna takes Arjun and he says, on day 1, this is the battle you have to fight. And then on day 2, he takes the chariot somewhere else and he says, Arjun, now this is the battle you have to fight. On day 3, he takes it somewhere else. And we have to think that that is exactly what is happening with us as well. So God and Guru are actually in charge of our chariot and are taking our lives to that specific challenge and saying, you know what, Anup, this is a challenge you have to fight today. You know, Shurjo, this is a challenge you have to fight today. Arni, this is a challenge you have to fight today. And that is exactly what is happening. And of course, God is not doing that to us simply because he's getting some sadistic pleasure out of watching us, going through pain or going through suffering. He's doing that simply because he loves us and because he wants to make us stronger. God sees us in our highest potential. Unfortunately, we don't see ourselves in our highest potential. And that is what God is trying to break. He's trying to break the delusion that I am this small little, kind of piece of consciousness. And he's saying, no, you are actually infinite. And that expansion happens only when we essentially get pushed. And if you just think about it, that is what, if you reflect on your whole life till now, just take a moment when you get time, reflect back on the biggest turning points that happened in your life. And you'll find that everything that you are today, the strength that you have today, is simply because of all the difficult turning points that happened in your life. If you didn't have those difficult turning points, you would simply not have the strength that you have today. So if that is true until now, if God has been taking care of me till now, why won't he take care of me going forward? Isn't it very simple? Somehow we think, oh no, abhi tak to theek hai, Bhagwan mere saath the. But from now on, that's it, I'm on my own. I'm not going to get any help from anyone. Right? That is the understanding that we need to come, that God has been with me, is with me, and always will be with me. And that's what Master says, we need to call out to God for help. What does he write in his poem? God, God, God. He says, when boisterous storms of trials shriek, and when worries howl at me, I will drown their noises by loudly chanting, God, God, God. Right? So when we call on God's help, he responds. In fact, there's actually a very funny, not funny, I would say interesting incident that happened with me a few weeks ago. I had been working on this one project for quite some time, I would say a few months, and it had just come almost into final fruition. Everything had to be closed. And last minute, something happened. Outside circumstances just changed, and basically the whole thing fell apart. And I was quite devastated because I'd hoped that this would actually get closed and I'd be able to move forward. But there was nothing I could do because it's something that happened completely and came from nowhere, and something that was completely out of my control. And I wish I could say that I was completely even-minded and cheerful, but I wasn't. But that was very interesting because it shook me a little bit. And I was worried. I was like, now if this doesn't happen now, then what is going to happen? How is it going to play out? I had made all these perfect plans. This is what I'm going to do, etc., etc. And it all basically went for a complete toss. And I was worried, and I was sort of praying to Master, what do we do? It's a bit complicated now, etc., etc., etc. In hindsight, actually, as it happened, I had to go to a photocopy shop to photocopy some documents. So I was sort of, while I was walking to the photocopy shop, I was praying to Master, what do we do? This is a bit complicated. More than praying, I realized in hindsight, I was just worrying. I was telling him about my worries rather than listening to what he has to say. So I was saying, Master, kya karen ye wo? And then I go to the photocopy shop and I give the documents to that photocopy guy. And very interestingly, on the shirt of that photocopy guy, I see a small patch here, which says, be a warrior, don't be a worrier. It was so interesting. And in fact, when I saw that, I laughed. I was like, oh my God, I mean, it was clearly coming from Master. And of course, I inwardly thanked Master. I thanked the photocopy guy. I was like, thank you for wearing that shirt. And he was looking at me, he's like, what's wrong with you? I mean, and in fact, he said, kya likha hai? So I said, dekho kya likha hai. And in fact, it was written all over his shirt, in fact. And I told him, I was like, I hope everyone in Mumbai city could be wearing a shirt like that. Because that's what we need, right? We need that understanding that we need to live life like a warrior and not a warrior. And we need to understand the fact that God is our mother, God is our father, and He is there to help us. He is there. If He has given us the challenge, He will give us the guidance, the solution, the strength, the intuition to take care of that problem. There is that amazing story of the Mahabharata as well, and many of us have known it. It's a time when Abhimanyu, if you remember in the Chakravyuh, he actually gets mercilessly killed by the Kauravas, and then that night Arjun makes this pledge. He said that I am going to kill Jayadratha, who was the main person responsible for that, in the next day. And he said, if I'm not able to kill him by sunset, I will kill myself. He makes that pledge, and the Kauravas know about this, and what they do is they essentially put the whole army of the Kauravas between Arjun and Jayadratha, hoping that he's not able to kill him, and hoping that at the end of the day, when the sun sets, Arjun will be killed, and that's it. That's pretty much the end of the war. So the Kauravas really hoping for that. Krishna, of course, knew what was going on also, and of course, the next day the war happens, and Arjun is battling hard. He's breaking through the army, but there's a huge army, and he's finding it harder and harder and harder to reach Jayadratha. And it's coming very close to sunset time, and Arjun knows if he is not able to kill him, that's the end, and Krishna knows that too. So what does Krishna do? Krishna, with his Sudarshan Chakra, his Sudarshan Chakra goes up to the sun, essentially causes a solar eclipse. And because the solar eclipse, and Jayadratha is hiding behind Duryodhan and Dronacharya. So because everyone thinks the sun is set, what does Jayadratha do? He comes out rejoicing, hey, great, I'm still alive, it's sunset, Arjun, now kill yourself. And what does Krishna do at that moment? He then pulls the chakra away, so the sun is shining again, and tells Arjun, shoot now. And he kills him, and essentially Jayadratha is dead. Now what I find, I mean, that story is interesting on so many levels, but what I find the most interesting out of all of that is that God, who is Krishna, bent the rules in order to help Arjun to fight a righteous war. When push comes to shove, and when the devotee really needs it, God will change the rules, right? Isn't that amazing? So that's what we need to remember. When we really need that help, God will change the rules, and He will actually give that help to us, right? And I'll just end with this, just a few words that Master writes in the autobiography. This is actually from the last chapter. This is one of my favorite chapters. I would highly urge you to read this. This is the years 1940 to 1951. And he says, God is love. His plan for creation can be rooted only in love. Does not that simple thought, more than any erudite cosmological tome, offer solace to the human heart? Every saint who has penetrated to the core of reality has testified that a divine universal plan exists, and that it is beautiful and full of joy. So always remember, whenever facing a challenge, know that God is there, know that Guru is there. Perhaps you can visualize the Guru on a horse in front of you, and you know that Master is going to be saying to you, you fought for me bravely then, won't you fight for me bravely now? God bless you.